Okay, this is the Unit 21 Part 1 and Part 2 video lesson. First, we're going to go over who is Charles Darwin. So for this first part of the notes, they're going to be filling in the Who is Charles Darwin interactive notebooking as part of your notes as we go through and talk about who he was and a little bit of history of how he got to researching and discovering what he discovered. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with Part 1. Make sure as you are watching this that you pause the video as needed and rewind and rewatch any parts that you may need to. Alright, so who is Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin, he lived about 200 years ago. He was born in 1809 in England, so he was English, and he loved nature. Okay, so our first blank is going to be nature. So Darwin is a nature lover. All right. He went and attended Christ College and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1881. And after graduating, his botany professor, botany is plants, study of plants. So his botany professor recommended him for a naturalist position. A naturalist is someone who studies nature, okay, on the Beagle. A Beagle was the name of a ship, right? And so this Beagle is going to take him on the trip of a lifetime as he travels around the world. At the end of this, after going on the Beagle and collecting different information, Darwin's actually going to publish a book of his findings called On the Origin of Species. And this is going to solidify him as the father of evolutionary biology. And he's actually he ended up dying in 1882. So he lived a nice long life and found lots of things that we still can observe today around us in the world. Before we talk about, before we go into Darwin's history, I want to talk about another guy named Lamarck. John Baptiste Lamarck. Okay, Lamarck, he believed in acquired traits. So basically, he thought that, we have a giraffe, and the giraffe, if it's going to be stretching out its neck over time to reach the leaves at the top of the tree, its neck's going to get longer, and then it's going to pass that longer neck on to its offspring. Well, we know that's not true, because if we think about it, if you get a tattoo, okay, your baby is not born with the same tattoo, right? So traits that we acquire throughout our life are not going to be passed on to our offspring unless it is in our DNA. Okay, so that's Lamarck. All right, so Lamarck preceded Darwin. Darwin's really going to be the first guy to kind of make sense about this whole thing of how things change over time and how we observe how things change over time. And at the time of when he's discovering all this stuff, he is not going to be very well accepted because of the type of society that he lived in. So his ideas are very controversial and revolutionary for his time period, and there's still lots of controversy even surrounding his ideas today. All right, so under your how flap, we're going to fill in the blanks there first. So Darwin obtained a naturalist position aboard a ship called the Beagle, which was captained by Robert Fitzroy, and the trip lasted. Alright, so the trip actually lasted for 5 years, and during this time they traveled all around the world. They started off from England, and they sailed down around the tip of South America and back up and then around Africa and back into England. So this whole time took 5 years. During this time, they stopped at many different places along the way to observe the animal and plant life in the different areas. And the whole purpose of this voyage was to create a map of the world and different things. So they're charting and making maps and observing different plant life around the world. So during this time, Darwin's collecting plants, animals, and fossils that he's going to be able to observe and take back home with him to share with people back in England. Alright, so Darwin's trip on the HMS Beagle lasted from 1831 to 1836. His favorite location is going to be the Galapagos Islands. This is where he got a lot of his inspiration for developing his theory of natural selection. So the Galapagos Islands are an archipelago found off of the coast of South America, and he's actually spent 5 weeks there, and his findings there are going to help him to develop his theories on natural selection and how things are changing in the natural world. So on the different islands, he had discovered that unique animals of the mainland and many islands were similar, to one another. So he's noticing that even though they're far away from the mainland, we still have traits that are similar to those on the mainland out here on these islands. So this began to lead him to consider where do these animals come from? How did they get there? And why did they vary just slightly from one another depending on their environment? So how come, where did they come from? How come there were slight variations? And how come those variations seem slightly different based on the environment in which those animals were living? So this is when he's beginning to start to question what he is seeing. Alright, so on the Galapagos Islands, Darwin is going to specifically study finches. A finch is a small type of bird. And they have different types of beaks. So we call these Darwin's finches, and they're still there on the islands today. And depending on which island you go to, they're going to have different shapes of beaks. Okay, and we'll figure out why in just a second. He determined that the finches varied from place to place because they all descended from a common ancestor on the mainland. So they had shared similarities. They weren't exactly the same. There were just small variations between each one because they had to be linked back to the common ancestor. The idea of a common ancestor is going to be a common theme and an important one to remember when we're talking about Darwin. Because Darwin's whole premise is that the idea that all living things came from a common ancestor. Right, so because the birds are isolated on different islands with various types of foods and climates, new traits were formed, causing them to evolve into 13 different finch species. Okay, so for instance, we have all these different types of beaks on our finches. If we look over here, we can see we have the large crushing beak all the way down to a smaller, skinnier, narrow beak. This is going to be the different types of beaks Darwin discovered are different based on the type of food that's available in that habitat or environment. So on the islands where we have the finches with the big, wide beaks, right, this means we're probably having seeds, mostly big, hard seeds that we have to be able to crush open to be able to eat. Okay, when we have the smaller beak, this means we're eating these small insects from inside of little nooks and crannies or crevices within trees or things like that. We have to have a smaller beak to be able to get to our food source. So depending on the type of food available, directly determine the type of beak that the finches are going to have on those islands. Right, your last flap is the Y. So it actually, it took Darwin about 20 years to fully develop his theory and share his findings in his book. Right, so his theory is called natural selection. So he talks about the theory of evolution through natural selection, which we're going to talk about next. So why did it take Darwin so long? If we think about this, we think about the time that he's living in. He's living in the mid to late 1800s. And during this time, the Church of England is the government, and it is basically what everyone lives by. And what Darwin is coming up with in his research directly is conflicting with the beliefs and the teachings of the Church of England. So he was ostracized, and his work was not taken well by the time period. And I think he knew this, so he wanted to make sure that whenever he did finally go public with what he found, that he had a lot of evidence to support what he was saying. All right, so back to natural selection. So it comes with this theory of natural selection. Natural selection is where the species that are best suited for their environment will survive and reproduce, which increases the strength of the species, while those that fail to adapt and reproduce are going to die off. So this is the idea of survival of the fittest. So, for instance, you all heard of that, the example of the moths, right? So the dark moths versus the white moths. Up until before the Industrial Revolution, right, the white-colored moths were the most common, okay? After the Industrial Revolution and all the pollution that was in the air, we see that we have a greater increase of the dark moths in the moth population. And this is because the habitat changed. So now it was more advantageous to have a darker coloration because you're able to blend in more with the environment and not be eaten by predators. Whereas the lighter colored moths are going to be seen and eaten by predators before the darker colored moths. So that is an example of survival of the fittest or natural selection. All right, so in 1859, Darwin is going to write and publish, this is when he's publishing On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection. All right, so this is where he is backing up his theory using the fossil record, embryology, and other things that he found and researched. All right, so he spent 20 years putting this book together to make sure that it was perfect, so that when he did publish, it was well supported and his findings had lots of evidence to back them up. Right, so that's going to conclude part 1 of when we discussed Charles Darwin. Now you need to get your natural selection and survival of the fittest interactive notebooking so that you can complete part 2. So in the second part of the video, we're actually going to discuss quickly the idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest and what that means. This should be more of a recap for you probably. Alright, so natural selection is the driving force behind evolution. Nature essentially decides who lives and who dies based on several factors. This is going to be based on a constant struggle to survive. We are competing for food, we're competing for resources, we're competing for shelter, those basic needs of survival. And as we are competing for those things to survive, right, certain organisms within a species might have certain advantages over others based on the types of traits that they have. Maybe they're born with a new trait, maybe they have a better coloration to hide from predators. Maybe they have, they're able to run a little faster to catch prey. Perhaps they have a specialized beak. A beak is a slightly different shape which allows them to get more food and food in a better way. So those are just examples of adaptations that are going to allow them to be slightly better suited for their environment. Right, so we have a constant struggle to survive. Right, this is going to mean that we're going to be introducing adaptations. And the adaptations are, if they're favorable, those organisms are going to be living and reproducing, because that means those traits are going to be passed on to their offspring. So we're going to be passing these favorable traits onto the offspring, okay, which is going to lead to the development of a population which leads to more offspring born than can survive. So this is going to be survival of the fittest. And this means that we are going to possibly be able to create a new species, the process of speciation, and which means we've evolved from a common ancestor over time. So if we look at natural selection, up here in the picture, we have a polar bear and a black bear. Okay, obviously the black bear is not going to survive very well in a polar bear environment in the snow. It's going to stick out like a sore thumb, and not be able to get food, because it's going to prey is going to see it coming before it's even there. So looking at our polar bear, it's going to be able to blend in with the environment better, which gives it a better chance of catching its prey and surviving. So polar bears weren't always white. This is something that's evolved over time. And so the white coat on a polar bear most likely resulted from a mutation. And so we get a polar bear cub that was born with white fur. And that cub had more advantages in the environment than its siblings. It was able to catch food and survive better than the others. So this became a favorable trait, and as it reproduced and passed that trait on, over time we see that there's more and more of the bears are born with a white coat because it's an advantage in that environment. That is a great example of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Right, on the last flap, survival of the fittest. This survival of the fittest is referring to the process of natural selection. So when we say survival of the fittest, this is a process of natural selection at work. So it does not mean that we're talking about the fittest in terms of strength or size of the organism, but we're talking about its ability to survive and reproduce within a particular environment. Okay, so like we're talking about with the coat color of the polar bears, or the beak shape in the Darwin's finches. Hold on. All right, so the ability of an organism to survive is based on their ability to finding food to eat, obtaining a mate, and securing its habitat or its shelter where it lives. Okay, so those are the basic things that all living organisms need to be able to survive and pass on their genetic information to the next generation. So individuals who are better suited for their environment are going to they're going to have a greater chance of passing their favorable traits on to the next generation. Which means that over time, each generation is going to have a higher concentration of these favorable traits. These traits are going to come from, they can arise from many different things, such as genetic mutations and just variation, which is going to lead to variation within our species, right? So the more variation we have in a species, this is going to increase the chance of that species surviving in a changing environment. So we know that environments are constantly changing. So if we have a greater variation within the species and a wider range of different types of traits, it's going to be more likely that at least one of those traits is going to end up being favorable in the new environment or the changing environment. So that's going to lead to the survival of the species as a whole. This means, though, that those that are not adapted to their environment do not reproduce as often or live as long. And so this is going to mean that an organism that survives but cannot reproduce, or one that reproduces but does not survive long, this is going to be, they're deemed unfit for that environment. All right, so we'll talk more about how there's other types of processes at play besides natural selection, but natural selection is the idea that drives evolution. It's the main one, and it's the one that Darwin discussed and discovered based on his trip around the world on the Beagle. Right, at this point you should have everything filled in on your interactive notebooking. Make sure you get this checked off and answer the question at the end of the video.